My grandmother smelled like lavender and cedar, and her house on Birchwood Lane smelled exactly like her. When she died, I thought I'd at least have that. Then my uncle called me 3 days after the funeral and said, "Rebecca, your grandmother wasn't thinking clearly at the end. We're going to need to sort this out properly." That was the moment I knew. And if he'd done even 5 minutes of research on what I do for a living, he never would have made that call. I'm a forensic accountant. I find money people try to hide. I do it every single day. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start with Grandma Ruth. She was 79 years old and sharp as a tack until the very end. That's not me being sentimental. That's me being accurate. She did the New York Times crossword in pen. She managed her own investment portfolio online. She called me every Sunday at 7 p.m. sharp, not 6,058, not 7,002. And she remembered every single detail of every conversation we'd ever had. 3 weeks before she died, she told me she'd updated her will, and that I didn't need to worry. "It's all buttoned up, Becca," she said. "Mr. Marthout here. Hartley's got the paperwork. You just take care of yourself." Mr. Hartley was her estate attorney. He'd been handling her affairs for over 20 years. I didn't think much of it at the time. She'd been sick, yes, a slow-moving heart condition that we'd known about for 2 years. But sick and incapacitated are two very different things, and anyone who knew Ruth Eleanor Marsh knew she was never incapacitated. She was the kind of woman who corrected people's grammar at her own doctor's appointments. She passed on a Thursday in October. The trees outside the hospital window were doing that thing they do in New England, all burning orange and deep red, and it was almost too beautiful for how awful it felt. I drove home to Millbrook, Connecticut from Boston. I'd been living there for work, and I stayed at a friend's place because the house on Birchwood Lane didn't feel like somewhere I could sleep yet. The funeral was on a Saturday. My uncle was there, of course. My father's older brother, a man named Gerald, who I'd spent my entire childhood being vaguely uncomfortable around without being able to say exactly why. He'd been living 40 minutes away from my grandmother for the past 12 years. He visited on holidays and sometimes birthdays. He remembered her when he needed something, a loan he never repaid in full, a co-signature on a refinance when his business was underwater. She'd always helped him. That was Grandma Ruth. She helped everyone who asked. Gerald stood at the graveside in a suit that was slightly too new, shaking hands with people he barely knew, accepting condolences with this practiced expression of grief that landed somewhere between sincerity and performance. I watched him from across the grave, and something cold moved through me that I chalked up to the October wind. 3 days later, he called. "Rebecca," he said in that particular voice of his, smooth, almost gentle, the voice of a man who sold car insurance for 20 years and never quite left that mode. "I've been talking to your grandmother's estate attorney, and I think there are some things we need to discuss before the reading." Before the reading. He said it so casually, like it was a detail to be managed rather than the legal instrument of a dead woman's wishes. "What kind of things?" I asked. "Well," a pause. "You know how she was at the end, sweetheart. Her memory wasn't what it used to be. She was on a lot of medications. I'm not sure she was entirely herself when she made some of these decisions. I'm just thinking about what's best for the family." I was standing in my friend's kitchen holding a mug of coffee that had gone cold, and I remember thinking, he has no idea. He genuinely has no idea what he just said to me, or who he said it to. I didn't let on. "Okay, Gerald," I said carefully. "Let's see what the will says and go from there." He made a small, agreeable sound and hung up. I stood there for a long moment. Then I called Mr. Hartley directly. The reading was the following Tuesday. The house on Birchwood Lane felt strange with Gerald in it, too loud, somehow, even when he wasn't speaking. He'd brought his son, my cousin Derek, who was 28 and worked for Gerald's landscaping company, and spent most of the reading looking at his phone under the table. Mr. Hartley was a trim, quiet man in his late 60s who had the unhurried calm of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. He read through the standard preambles, and then he got to the substance of it. The house on Birchwood Lane, the only property in the estate, was left to me, along with its contents. Along with the bulk of her liquid assets, her savings account, her small mutual fund, the emergency CD she'd kept at Millbrook Savings and Trust since 1987. A specific bequest of $15,000 was left to Gerald, described in the will as a final gift, in full acknowledgement of all prior support provided. The phrasing was precise and deliberate. It was Grandma Ruth being extremely clear, in legal language, that this was the end of something and not the beginning. Gerald went very still. Derek looked up from his phone. I said nothing. I looked at Mr. Telbull Hartley, who was calmly continuing to read, and I thought about my grandmother on the phone 3 weeks before she died, saying, "It's all buttoned up, Becca." She'd known exactly what she was doing. Gerald didn't say a word during the reading. He waited until we were in the driveway in the cold gray afternoon, and then he put his hand on my arm and said, "Rebecca, I don't want to fight about this, but what she left me doesn't cover what I've put into this family over the years. I was here. I was the one who took her to her appointments, who fixed the gutters, who helped her when the furnace went out. That counts for something." "It does count for something," I said. "It counted for $15,000. His hand tightened slightly on my arm. "Just slightly." "She wasn't well," he said. "I think we both know that. I think we both know she was fine," I said pleasantly and got in my car. He called again 2 weeks later. This time he didn't start with family. He started with an attorney. A man named Phil, who had an office in Hartford and a LinkedIn profile that described him as specializing in estate disputes and contested wills. Phil had a very reasonable voice and a very unreasonable agenda. "Your grandmother's medical records indicate she was on several medications in her final year," Phil said when he called. "Medications that can impact cognitive function. We're simply asking the court to take a closer look before assets are transferred." "She was on a diuretic and a beta blocker," I said, "both of which are entirely standard for her condition and neither of which impairs cognitive function. I have her complete medical history." Phil paused. "You have her medical history?" "She gave me healthcare power of attorney in 2019. I have everything." Another pause. "Well," he said, "there are also questions about undue influence. Your grandmother was elderly and isolated, and you were in regular contact with her. Weekly phone calls," I said, "which she initiated. Would you like the phone records? I have those too." The call ended shortly after, but the petition arrived 2 weeks after that. Gerald and Derek, represented by Phil's firm, filed to contest the will. Grounds: diminished capacity. Grounds: undue influence. Grounds: the usual language that means, in plain English, we didn't get what we wanted and we're going to make this as expensive and painful as possible until you give up. I took 3 days. I cried some, which I hadn't let myself do much yet. I drove up to Birchwood Lane and walked through the house in the dark, turning lights on one room at a time. The kitchen still smelled like her. The crossword on the table was 2/3 finished, the pen sitting across the corner like she'd just stepped away for a minute. Then I called my firm's legal liaison and told her I needed a referral for an estate litigation attorney. She said, "How contested are we talking? They're alleging diminished capacity on a woman who did the crossword in pen until 3 weeks before she died," I said. "And I'm a forensic accountant with 5 years of her financial records." There was a short silence. "Then, I have exactly the right person." Her name was Diane Okafor, and she had the sort of office that communicated without saying anything that she had won a lot. She read the petition without expression, asked me 4 precise questions, and then looked up and said, "They made a significant error in judgment filing this." "I know," I said. "They've opened discovery," she said. "You understand what that means, given your background." "That's why I'm here," I said. Diane's first move was the obvious one. We subpoenaed my grandmother's complete financial records going back 7 years. 7 years felt like a lot, I told Diane. She said if Gerald was managing any of her accounts or had access to them, 7 years is where we start. The claim of cognitive decline implies a long vulnerability window, so we look at the whole window. I didn't say what I was already thinking, what I'd been quietly, uncomfortably thinking since Gerald's hand on my arm in the driveway, the way he'd said I was here, the way he'd catalogued his own helpfulness like a man keeping a ledger. My grandmother had given Gerald secondary access to her primary checking account in 2018. She'd told me about it at the time. She said it was practical. He lived nearby and could handle things when she needed help, transfer money to pay a contractor, cover an emergency. She trusted him. She'd always trusted him more than he deserved, and I think she knew that, and she loved him anyway, because that was who she was. The statements came back in batches. Diane's paralegal organized them into a master spreadsheet. I sat at Diane's conference table with a second laptop and went through them the same way I'd go through anything at work, methodically, line by line, looking for the pattern before I looked for the problem. I found the pattern on a Wednesday afternoon in November, with rain hitting the windows and a cup of coffee going cold at my elbow. Starting in March of 2019, there was a recurring transfer, $1,800. The 15th of every month, moving from my grandmother's checking account to an external account. The memo line said, household maintenance. I flagged it. Pulled the next year. Every month, $1,800 household maintenance. Then in June of 2021, a second transfer appeared. This one for $24, no memo. I sat back in my chair, $1,800, $1,800, and $800 a month for 4 years is $86,400. The second transfer, $2,400 a month starting June 2021, that was 2 years before she died, so roughly $57,600. Combined, over $140,000 in recurring transfers, none of which appeared anywhere in the estate inventory Gerald had submitted as part of his petition. I called Diane. How fast can you get the destination account information? I asked. We already requested it, she said. What did you find? I told her. The line was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the $1,800. What was her average monthly household expense before that started? I already knew. I'd looked. Around $400. Property taxes, utilities, phone, internet. She owned the house outright and had no debt. So we have a $1,400 a month discrepancy, Diane said, starting the same year Gerald got account access. And a second transfer that started 2 years in, I said, with no memo and no apparent purpose. Okay, Diane said. She sounded the way she always sounded, even, focused, like this was a problem being solved rather than a wrong being uncovered. The destination account records will take another week, but I want to schedule the mandatory mediation now. I want to be in that room when they see what we have. The mediation was held at a neutral office in Hartford, beige carpet and fluorescent lighting, and a tired mediator named Charles, who looked like he'd spent 20 years watching people be awful to each other over dead relatives' money. Gerald and Derek sat across from us with Phil, who was in a sport coat that matched his LinkedIn headshot. Gerald looked confident. Derek was on his phone again. Diane laid a single folder on the table. She didn't open it. Before we discuss any offers, she said, addressing Phil directly, I want to put something on the record. We've completed the first phase of our financial discovery. Phil smiled the smile of a man who was expecting a formality. Of course. Diane opened the folder and slid a single sheet across the table. It was the summary I'd prepared. Dates, amounts, a clean column of running totals. No commentary, just numbers. Beginning in March of 2019, Diane said, there were systematic monthly transfers from Ruth Marsh's primary checking account to an external account. These transfers total, across the full period, approximately $144,000. They are not represented in the estate inventory. They do not correspond to any documented household expense. Phil picked up the paper. The smile stayed on his face for approximately 3 more seconds, and then it didn't. Gerald looked at the paper. His jaw moved slightly, like he was chewing something, but he didn't speak. Derek had put down his phone. We have also identified, Diane continued, not pausing, a secondary transfer series beginning June 2021, totaling an additional $57,600. The destination account for both transfer series is a joint account held by Gerald Marsh and Derek Marsh at First Federal in Simsbury. Derek said, What? In a very small voice. Gerald said nothing. I had been watching my uncle's face since Diane started speaking. He didn't look panicked exactly. He looked like a man who had known, somewhere in the back of his mind, that a room like this one existed, and had been hoping he'd never end up in it. Gerald, I said, because I needed to say it myself. That's $144,000 in one set of transfers and nearly $58,000 in another. From an elderly woman's account that you had access to in order to pay her utility bills. She knew about those transfers, Gerald said. His voice was steady. I gave him credit for that. She authorized them. I was providing ongoing support services. My time has value. Then you have invoices, Diane said, documentation of the services, a written agreement, a 1099, since payments of that amount would constitute taxable income. Gerald looked at Phil. Phil was still looking at the paper. I'm going to suggest, Phil said carefully, that we take a short recess. Of course, Diane said. The recess lasted 40 minutes. When they came back, Phil informed us that his client would not be discussing the financial transfers in this form and would be consulting with separate counsel regarding that matter specifically. This was, as Diane later explained to me in the elevator, the sound of a civil attorney realizing he was now adjacent to a potential criminal matter and wanting to create some distance between himself and it. The mediation ended without resolution. We knew it would. What happened next happened faster than I expected. The destination account records came in. The $1,800 monthly transfers, labeled household maintenance in my grandmother's account, had been going directly into Gerald's personal checking account. The total $400 transfers had been going into a joint account held by Gerald and Derek. In the years covered by our subpoena, Gerald had transferred $144,000 from my grandmother's account into his own. An additional $57,600 had gone to the joint account. Derek, as joint account holder, had drawn from it regularly: gas, groceries, a lease payment on a truck, a vacation to Myrtle Beach in August 2022. I sat with those records for a long time. My grandmother had been paying for Derek's truck. She hadn't known that. She had thought she was paying for her gutters to be cleaned. I thought about calling Derek. I thought about what I wanted to say, and whether any of it would matter, and I decided to let the process do what it was built to do. The trial date was set for January. 2 weeks before it, Derek called me. He didn't apologize, exactly. He said, I didn't know where the money was coming from. Dad told me it was a loan from him. He said Grandma had given him money for years, and this was just him passing it on. He paused. I know how that sounds. It sounds like something you'll need to explain to an attorney, I said. I already have one, he said quietly. A different one than Dad. He testified at the trial. He answered every question Diane asked him, and he looked exactly like what he was. A 28-year-old who had let himself not ask questions because the answers might have been inconvenient, and who was now sitting with the full weight of that in a very cold courtroom. Gerald's new attorney, a criminal defense lawyer named Mr. Basso, advised him to exercise his Fifth Amendment rights on every question related to the financial transfers, which meant that for every question Diane asked, the courtroom heard Gerald say, in a flat voice, that he was declining to answer on the grounds that it might incriminate him. 22 times. I counted. The judge was a woman in her mid-60s named the Honorable Patricia Webb, and she had the expression of someone who had heard a great many things in that courtroom and was prepared to hear more, but was not prepared to be bored by them. She asked Gerald's attorney exactly once whether his client had any explanation for the documented transfers. His attorney said his client would be exercising his Fifth Amendment rights. The judge made a note. Diane presented the full financial picture without theatrics. She presented Mr. Hartley's testimony. Grandma Ruth had been mentally sharp and deliberate at the time of the will's drafting, had raised specific questions about the language, had made one revision before signing. She presented Dr. Almeida, my grandmother's cardiologist, who testified that her condition was cardiac, not neurological, and that he'd observed no cognitive decline in any of their appointments. She presented the phone records, 71 calls initiated by my grandmother to my number over the preceding 2 years, almost all of them on Sunday evenings at 7 o'clock, because that's who she was. And then Diane presented the financial records, all of it laid out in plain language, the way I'd organized it, the transfers, the destination accounts, the total $201,600, because when we added in several one-time transfers we'd initially set aside pending verification, the number crossed $200,000. She put that number up as a single exhibit in large print and let the courtroom look at it. Judge Webb looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at Gerald. He didn't look back. The ruling came in the afternoon. The petition to contest the will was denied. The will was valid. The house on Birchwood Lane was mine, along with its contents and the remaining estate assets. Judge Webb awarded me legal fees in full. She also awarded punitive damages of $40,000, citing the petition as frivolous and filed in manifest bad faith. Specifically, she noted, in an apparent attempt to prevent the rightful executor from examining the estate's financial records closely. And then she said, the court is referring this complete record, including all financial documentation and testimony, to the Connecticut State's Attorney's Office for investigation into potential financial elder abuse under Connecticut General Statutes Section 53, a 199 big, and potential larceny in the first degree. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The room was absolutely silent. Gerald sat at his table and stared at the wood grain in front of him. His attorney put a hand briefly on his arm, the automatic gesture of someone managing a client through the worst moment they've seen all year. Derek, who had been sitting 2 rows behind me, let out a long, slow breath. I heard it. I didn't turn around. The state's attorney moved quickly. Gerald was formally charged 4 months later. 1 count of financial exploitation of an elderly person, 2 counts of first-degree larceny. The figures in the charging documents were specific, $201,600 over a period of 4 years and 8 months. His attorney entered a not guilty plea, but the evidence Diane and I had assembled was dense and documented and exact. That tends to matter. Derek cooperated fully with the investigation. His own attorney negotiated an immunity agreement in exchange for his testimony about the account arrangements, the transfers, and the specific conversations he'd had with Gerald about where the money was coming from. He was not charged. He sold the truck. He got a job at a logistics company in Meriden and, to my knowledge, has kept his head down since. I used part of the punitive damages to hire a cleaning service and a professional organizer to help me go through the house properly. I wasn't ready to do it alone, and I didn't pretend otherwise. We went room by room over 3 weekends, and I kept far more than I donated. Because almost everything my grandmother owned had a story attached to it that I wanted to be able to tell someday. The half-finished crossword is still on the kitchen table. I've thought about finishing it about 100 times, and I haven't, because it's hers and I'm not sure it's mine to complete. Maybe that's irrational. I'm a forensic accountant, so I'm allowed one irrational thing. I've been staying at the house on weekends since January. It still smells like lavender and cedar, which is something I wasn't sure would last, and I'm relieved it has. I fixed the porch step that had been slightly soft for 2 years. I cleaned out the gutters myself, in March, standing on a ladder in the cold, thinking about the $1,800 a month that was supposed to be covering exactly this kind of thing. I think about my grandmother a lot when I'm there. I think about the fact that she set this up carefully. She chose Mr. Hartley, she chose her language, she made sure her wishes were precise and documented. She knew her son. She knew his sharp edges and his convenient memory, and the way he tallied things in his mind like debts that other people owed him. She had loved him anyway because she was capable of loving someone clearly and still. But she had also been practical enough not to leave her legacy to his discretion. She left me the tools, same as she always had. She left me the documentation, the paper trail, the clean, organized record of a life managed carefully. She left me a house that smells like her. She trusted me to understand what to do with all of it. Gerald's trial is set for the fall. I'll go, I think. Not out of satisfaction, or not only out of that, but because I was her executor and I intend to see it through. I'm a forensic accountant. Seeing it through is what I do. If you're watching from somewhere that's felt like Birchwood Lane to you, a place someone tried to take, a loss that someone tried to make worse, I hope you know that documentation is a form of love. It's the way some people say, this mattered. This was real. I'm going to make sure it stays that way. Make sure you're subscribed if you want to know what happens next, and let us know in the comments, where are you all watching from today? We read every single one. I've thought a lot about what made Gerald believe he could get away with it. And I think the answer is simpler than I wanted it to be. He had been getting away with it for years. Not in a courtroom. Not in any dramatic way. Just quietly, steadily, in the small daily decisions of a man who had trained himself to believe that proximity to someone entitled him to their resources. He was nearby. He was helpful, in the transactional way that people are helpful when they're also keeping score. And so, over time, he started treating my grandmother's account the way some people treat a vending machine they've figured out how to get things from for free. A little at a time. With a reasonable-sounding label on it. What strikes me now is that he never expected the will to hold. He expected me to look at a legal fight, look at the cost and the time and the ugliness of it, and decide that $15,000 and a graceful exit was the smarter choice. He thought I'd take the path of least resistance. A lot of people would have. I almost understand the logic of betting on that. But here's what he didn't account for. I had been trained, professionally and by temperament, to follow a number to wherever it led. That's not courage, that's just habit. The courage part was deciding that my grandmother's last clear act of love and intention was worth the fight, even when the fight was expensive and exhausting and involved sitting across a table from my own family and watching them lie about a woman they'd both watched die. Gerald made a choice. He made it slowly, over years, in small increments he probably convinced himself were justified. That's how these things usually work. Not a single dramatic betrayal, but a long series of small ones, each one making the next a little easier, until the person has built a whole architecture of rationalization around something that is, stripped of all the justification, just theft. He stole from an old woman who trusted him. He used her trust as the mechanism, and then, when she died and the mechanism stopped working, he tried to use the legal system to take the one thing she'd been careful enough to put out of his reach. What I want to say to anyone watching this who's in the middle of something like it, whether it's a will, a business, a home, anything someone tried to take from you, using the language of family and reasonableness, is this: documentation is not aggression. Knowing your rights is not being difficult. The people who benefit from you not asking questions will always frame the questions as the problem. They will call you technical or cold or obsessed with money, right up until the moment they realize the questions have answers they can't survive. My grandmother kept a clean record of her life. She chose her attorney carefully. She chose her language carefully. She made sure that what she wanted was written down and witnessed and stored in a place where it couldn't be quietly reinterpreted. She did all of that because she knew her son, and she loved him anyway, and she also knew the difference between love and trust. You can love someone and still not hand them the keys. I sit on her porch now on Sunday evenings, sometimes with the crossword she never finished, and I think about the kind of person she was, precise and warm, and entirely clear-eyed about the world she lived in. She left me a house. She also left me a way of moving through things. Eyes open, records intact, willing to follow the number wherever it goes. That's the inheritance that mattered most.